Marcus raised his champagne glass in front of our biggest client and said, "Let's be honest, I built this company. Ray here just keeps the lights on," and 40 people at the holiday party laughed. I was standing 3 feet away, holding a glass I hadn't touched, wearing a suit I'd bought for exactly this kind of night. I'd spent 6 years building the technology this company sold. My name was on the patent filing in a drawer in my home office, filed 2 years before Marcus and I had even agreed to call ourselves partners. I smiled. I raised my glass with everyone else. I let him have the room. "I want you to hold on to that detail because it matters later." I didn't correct him in front of Ellen Vasquez, the client whose account represented 40% of our annual revenue. I didn't mention the patent, or the fact that the core compression algorithm powering every product we'd sold in 3 years belonged to me, individually, filed under my name before Vantis Systems existed as a legal entity. I just smiled, sipped my untouched champagne, and quietly watched Ellen Vasquez laugh along with a joke about a man she didn't know she was about to need. That was the last holiday party I would ever spend letting someone else wear the credit for something only I could build. My name is Raymond Ochoa. I'm 39 years old. I hold a PhD in computer engineering and, more relevantly, I hold United States Patent 10,847,291. A data compression architecture I designed alone in a rented apartment during the 18 months after my first company folded and before anyone believed in me again. I met Marcus Delacroix at an industry conference 7 years ago. He was magnetic in the way certain founders are, the kind of person who could describe an idea he barely understood and make a room lean forward. I liked him immediately. I still, in some complicated way, like him now. We founded Vantis Systems together 6 years ago. I brought the technology. He brought the charisma, the investor relationships, the ability to close a room. We split equity 50-50 on a handshake that later became a real operating agreement, except the operating agreement, drafted quickly by a lawyer Marcus knew, never actually assigned the core patent to the company. It was licensed to Vantis, exclusively renewable annually. I signed it without reading the licensing clause closely, because 6 years ago I trusted my partner more than I trusted paperwork. I want you to hold on to that detail because it matters later. For 6 years I did the quiet work. I built the engineering team. I personally rewrote the core architecture twice as we scaled. I flew out for client escalations Marcus didn't want to handle. I worked 80-hour weeks during our Series B raise while Marcus took investor dinners and told rooms full of people a version of our origin story that gradually, gently, edited me out of the parts that mattered. I let it happen because the company was succeeding, because I told myself the work would speak for itself eventually, because Marcus, in private, always thanked me, just never in public and never in front of anyone whose opinion could move the needle. By year 6, I had built the entire technical foundation of a company valued at $84 million, and my title on our own website was co-founder engineering. Marcus's was founder CEO. That was the last year I would confuse being essential with being seen. Welcome back to Dad's Sweet Revenge. If you've ever built something with your own hands and watched someone else take the bow, settle in, because this one is for you. Let's get into it. The erasure was gradual, the way most erasures are. It didn't start with malice. It started with narrative convenience. In year 2, at a tech conference, Marcus told a reporter he'd come up with the core algorithm on a napkin during a flight. I was in the audience. I laughed it off afterward when he apologized. Media just wants a simple story. Ray, you know how it is. In year 3, our investor deck listed him first, alone, on the founder vision slide. My section was titled Engineering Leadership 2 slides later with a smaller photo. In year 4, Ellen Vasquez's company, Marlowe Retail Group, signed on as our anchor client. A deal I had personally closed after 3 months of technical due diligence with their engineering team, walking them through the architecture line by line, answering questions Marcus couldn't have answered if his life depended on it. At the signing dinner, Marcus told the story of how we landed Marlowe without using my name once. I didn't say anything. I told myself it didn't matter, that the work spoke louder than the story. I want you to hold on to that detail because it matters later. In year 5, the annual patent license renewal, the one clause in our operating agreement that quietly gave me leverage neither of us talked about, came up for its yearly rubber stamp. Marcus's lawyer sent it to me buried in a batch of routine paperwork. I signed it, as always, without complaint. I still believed, at that point, That loyalty was a kind of collateral that eventually paid out. By year 6, Marcus had started referring to me in front of newer employees as our head of engineering instead of co-founder. A small linguistic demotion nobody but me seemed to notice, or maybe everyone noticed and simply didn't think it was their place to say anything. What Marcus didn't know was that I had started keeping a folder. Not out of paranoia, out of habit, the same instinct that had made me file that patent alone, years before I trusted anyone enough to call them a partner. Every version of the origin story he told publicly. Every press mention. Every slide deck. Every date the patent license had been renewed, and under exactly what terms. That was the last year I would let documentation be optional. The holiday party was our biggest of the year, the one where we invited every major client, every investor, every board member. In a rented rooftop space downtown with a view Marcus liked to reference in every toast he gave. Ellen Vasquez flew in personally. Marlowe Retail Group had just approved a 3-year renewal worth $11 million, the largest single contract in company history, and Marcus wanted her there to celebrate it publicly. He gave his toast standing near the bar, glass raised. The whole room turned toward him the way rooms always turn toward Marcus. He thanked our investors. He thanked our sales team by name. He thanked Ellen personally, warmly, genuinely. He was good at that part, I'll give him that. Then, gesturing loosely in my direction without quite looking at me, he said it. And let's be honest. I built this company. Ray here just keeps the lights on. 40 people laughed. Ellen left. Not cruelly. She didn't know any better. She'd spent 3 months with me during due diligence, watched me answer questions her own engineers couldn't stump me on, and she still laughed because in that room at that moment Marcus's version of the story was the only one anyone had ever been told. I laughed too. I raised my glass. I found a spot near the window and stood there for the rest of the party, watching Marcus work the room, watching Ellen shake his hand twice more before the night was over. I didn't say a word that night. I didn't need to. I already knew, standing at that window with an untouched glass of champagne, exactly what I was going to do. I didn't know it yet, but by the time the renewal came up next quarter, Marcus would be the one standing at a window. I didn't confront Marcus the next day. I didn't confront him at all, actually. Confrontation would have meant explaining myself, and I was done explaining myself to a man who'd spent 6 years explaining me out of my own story. The decision came quietly over a long weekend the way real decisions usually do, not as an eruption but as a recalibration. I sat with my patent folder, my 6 years of documentation, and asked myself a simple engineering question. What is actually load-bearing here and what has just been decoration? The answer was uncomfortable and simple. Marcus was the decoration. I was the architecture. The patent license, the one clause neither of us ever discussed out loud, renewed annually every February, with 60 days written notice required if either party chose not to renew. It was March. I had 11 months before the next renewal window opened, and for the first time in 6 years, I intended to use every one of them deliberately. That was the last time I would let a renewal happen by default instead of by choice. I called an intellectual property attorney the following Monday, not our company's counsel, mine personally, a woman named Priya Anand who specialized in exactly this kind of quiet leverage. I brought her the operating agreement, the licensing clause, 6 years of documentation, and asked her one question. If I chose not to renew the license next February, what happens to Vantis Systems? Her answer, after reviewing everything for a week, was direct. Without that patent, Vantis has no core technology. Every product, every client contract, every valuation number depends on architecture that legally belongs to one person, and that person is not obligated to keep sharing it forever. I want you to hold on to that number because it matters later, 11 months. I didn't quit dramatically. I didn't storm out. For the next several months, I did my job exactly as well as I always had, better actually, because for the first time in years I wasn't performing gratitude for scraps of visibility. I was simply doing excellent, quiet, documented work, the same as always, while 11 months counted down in the background. In September I began methodically building something of my own, a new architecture, adjacent to but legally distinct from the patented compression system, developed entirely on my own time on my own equipment with dated version logs Priya had advised me to keep meticulously. Not a copy. An evolution. Something I would own outright, cleanly, from day one this time. In November at the next holiday party, because Marcus, unaware anything had shifted, insisted on the same rooftop venue, the same toast structure, the same warmth toward the same clients. I stood at the same window, and this time I wasn't waiting. I was watching the countdown. In January, I gave formal written notice through Priya that Vantis Systems' licensed United States patent 10,847,291 would not be renewed upon expiration in 60 days, per the terms of our own operating agreement, the one Marcus's own lawyer had drafted 6 years earlier, when neither of us thought the clause would ever matter. I want you to hold on to that detail because it matters later. Marcus had drafted the very document that would end him. I resigned the same week, effective at the 60-day mark, citing pursuit of independent opportunities. Language so bland it could have meant anything, and did. I didn't call Ellen Vasquez myself. I didn't need to. Priya's notice went to Vantis's counsel, and Vantis's counsel, reading the licensing clause for the first time in 6 years with real attention, understood immediately what was about to happen to their largest client relationship. The calls started 3 days after the notice went out. Marcus first. 6 calls in one afternoon, each one going to voicemail, each message shifting in tone from confused to furious to, by the 5th message, something close to pleading. I didn't answer. I had spent 6 years answering. This time, the not answering was the entire point. Our head of sales texted me, "What is happening? Is this real? Please call me." I didn't respond. I liked her. I felt for her. But I hadn't drafted the clause that made her job possible, and I wasn't the one who'd spent 6 years pretending I hadn't. Marcus emailed on day 5, a long message that tried 3 tones in the same paragraph. First legal threats about irreparable harm to the business, then an appeal to friendship, then finally something almost like an apology, vague and unspecific, the kind that apologizes for how things ended up without naming anything he'd actually done. I forwarded it to Priya without comment. For 19 days, I said almost nothing publicly. I finished my consulting work with my old university lab. I started drafting the technical framework for what would become my own company. I let the silence do what 6 years of speaking up never had. I let people draw their own conclusions from what was actually happening to Vantis's client relationships in real time, without my narrative getting in the way. That was the last time I would explain myself preemptively to anyone who hadn't first taken the time to ask. Ellen Vasquez called me directly in February, not Vantis me, 3 weeks after the license lapsed, and Vantis's engineering team, for the first time in company history, had to explain to Marlowe Retail Group why the compression architecture powering their entire product integration had legally stopped being available for use. She asked carefully, professionally, whether I was building anything new. I incorporated Ochoa Systems in March, funded entirely by my own savings and a small angel round from 2 former colleagues who'd watched the whole Vantis story unfold from a distance and understood exactly what they were investing in. Marlowe Retail Group signed with Ochoa Systems in May, a 4-year, $14 million contract, larger than the one Marcus had toasted 11 months earlier, this time with my name, and only my name, on the founding documents. Vantis Systems, without its core technology, lost 2 additional major clients by summer. Marcus, I heard through mutual industry contacts, spent months trying to reverse engineer an alternative architecture that never came close to matching the original. By August, Vantis had laid off 1/3 of its engineering team. I don't take pleasure in that part. I take pleasure in the part where, in October, a trade publication ran a feature on emerging compression technology companies, and for the first time in 7 years, a journalist wrote my name first. By December, 1 year after that rooftop toast, Ochoa Systems had 11 employees, 2 enterprise contracts, an evaluation conversation with investors that used, for once, the correct origin story, the true one, the one where a man builds something alone in a rented apartment, and eventually stops letting anyone else tell it for him. People think revenge requires confrontation. It doesn't. Sometimes it just requires reading your own contract carefully, and finally exercising the leverage you'd always had but never used. I didn't destroy Marcus. I simply stopped subsidizing a story that had never included me, and let the architecture underneath it do what unsupported structures eventually do. For 6 years, I mistook loyalty for invisibility, and told myself that was the price of being essential. It never was. The 2 things were never actually connected, and the day I understood that was the day the countdown started. I don't hate Marcus. I think about that toast sometimes, though not with anger anymore, just with a kind of clarity. He built a company on my architecture and never once thought to ask what would happen if I finally decided to build my own. If you've ever done the work and watched someone else take the credit, this one was for you. That's exactly what this channel exists for. Patience, quiet leverage, and the moment someone finally stops explaining themselves. Subscribe to Dad's Sweet Revenge for more stories like Raymond's, and tell me in the comments, what's the clause in your own life you've never used yet? See you in the next one.